Loud and clear. Health and Wealth Radio, WNN.
Times are tough, and right now those in the commercial world know that being heard via advertisements is the name of the game. AmpSquare.tv understands how important advertisement is and is proud to express that it's truly the only plugged-in internet television production company on the market. Amp2.tv live streams all their shows across all the major selling markets in the U.S. and abroad. Call them at 866-224-5422. The AmpSquare.tv library allows productions to be seen over and over again, making commercial platforms more usable. Call 866-224-5422. Toll free 866-224-5422. Amp2.tv, the first and only internet television network that's truly plugged in. 866-224-5422. That's AMP2.TV.
1470 AM and 95.3 FM. The Health and Wealth Radio Network. Listen for the latest on nutritional facts on Food for Thought with your host, Jolie Root. Mondays at noon. WNN.
The opinions expressed on the following sponsored program are strictly those of the host, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of this station, its staff, management, or sponsors. It's Monday night at 9. Time for Sex Talk with Dr. Richard Siegel, a certified sex therapist and sexuality educator. Dr. Siegel is here to answer all your questions about sex and sexuality that you might not have known who to ask. He'll also welcome special guests to talk about a wide variety of topics within the fascinating world of sexuality. So, welcome to Sex Talk.
Good evening, and welcome back. And thanks for joining us. It's Sex Talk with Dr. Richard Siegel. Give us a call at 1-888-565-1470. We'd love to answer your questions and hear your comments. I'm here once again with my best guest, my big brother, Larry Siegel.
Always a pleasure to be here.
Indeed, a pleasure to have you. Following in your footsteps into this, following your footsteps into this weird, wacky, wonderful career. This world of sexology, where, as we like to say, you could study it for 200 years and never finish.
That's right.
Never complete the study. So, as we've been talking for the last couple of weeks about things that irritate and anger and annoy us, about trying to do this work in a sex-negative culture, working so often upstream, forget it, more like sweeping the ocean with a broom, it seems sometimes.
Yeah.
And whether it's sex education or exploitation, or last week we were just talking about the inability we have to use language in a way that's not ridiculous and childish and afraid and reflective of puritanical attitudes.
Sure. I mean, it's just one other example of where I think we overall fall short when it comes to communication.
Right. Communication about sexuality.
Well, I'd say communication about anything, really, but it really comes to the surface in relationships.
And sex as communication doesn't get talked about enough.
Yeah.
That ends up such a buzzword for therapists avoiding talking about sex. Right? We need to talk about your communication first. How many couples have come for therapy almost, after begging, can we please talk about this sexual problem, only to be told, well, we really need to keep working on your communication first. Like classic, whose stuff is it?
Exactly. I mean, especially when they also throw on, it's like, well, we're not there. We have to build this rapport first. We have to get to the point where, you're comfortable. And I think that's really just a therapist saying, I am not comfortable.
Right. So 3 sessions in, 4 sessions in, the big drum rolls. So, how's your sex life? Please say fine. Please say fine.
Right.
Please say fine. Couple says, fine. Good.
Okay, good.
Let's talk about your communication some more.
Right.
What does fine mean?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, we know that in recovery circles that means something.
Right. Yeah. But in most circles, fine means either great, thanks, or I don't want to talk about it. Let's be polite. right? Like when you run into a friend on the street and say, "How are you?" You're not supposed to answer that question. Nobody wants the literal answer to that question. The expected answer is fine, thank you. How are you? Right? Nobody wants to hear, "Oh, my back hurts. I've been having problems."
Well,
with
that's part of this overall communication thing. That's exactly right. We say these things in passing. We say these things as a blow off, right? We don't even when it comes to saying goodbye. See you later. I'll call you. And none of these have any meaning.
Sure.
Right? We don't follow through. Again, we ask people, "How are you doing?" We really don't want to hear how they're doing.
But therapy, psychotherapy is supposed to be talk therapy, right? Where words matter, and it's supposed to, everything is diagnostic. So, right, if the answer to that question, "How's your sex life?" is fine, and an appropriate follow-up question is great, glad to hear it. When was the last time you two had any sexual intimacy together? And you hear, "Well, it's been about 9 months." Then we can go, okay, let's go back to what fine means.
Right. And I would even start off with that when somebody says fine. I mean, you have a fine tooth comb. You have fine hair. We have fine point pens. Fine is not a state of being. When it's used that way, it's generally an avoidance.
Yeah, like it's fine.
So
thanks,
if they do
we
say,
don't
"Yeah,
need
everything
to."
is fine," so what does that mean?
Yeah. Again, we talk often about sex therapy being, for some therapists, a tool in their toolbox, among other tools. For other sex therapists like myself, I tend to see it as the lens through which I do therapy.
Sure.
Right. It's a bias. It's a way of especially with couples, conceptualizing what's going on with them, and it's certainly part of the diagnosis. So of course, that doesn't mean 100% of my practice is sex therapy, but when a couple comes in, I'm certainly going to ask. And it's wonderful. Sometimes a couple says, "Oh no, we're not here for that. Our sex life is great. We're here because we're fighting all the time."
And sometimes they do need
And
communication.
I say, great, I'm glad to hear it. But, it helps me to understand, indulge me, if you will, right? It's part of my diagnostic process. And, of course, 8 out of 10 times, there's plenty to talk about that, again, might have been blown off in previous therapy where it just, as we've been talking about every week now, it doesn't get asked.
Right.
How absurd was that study? I think 2 weeks ago you referenced that old Procter and Gamble study where they found that the number one reason patients don't ask doctors about sexual issues is for fear of embarrassing them. Like we're still there.
Right.
Really, patients have to worry about embarrassing their doctors, so they don't ask the question.
Right.
So the doctor gets off the hook if they don't ask the patient the question.
Exactly. And, and going back to what you said before about, sex as a form of communication, it really is so important. I believe, was it Barry McCarthy who first put out this notion that when sex is good in a relationship, then it represents about 15%
like of
the overall
building,
relationship.
like an improvement of the relationship.
Right, exactly.
Right.
But the place that sex holds is about 15%. Yet when it's bad, and not just the sex, when all the dynamics of the relationship, then sex takes on this disproportionate 70%.
Like 50, I think 50%.
50%.
Yeah,
right?
it detracts way more than it strengthens, it seems.
Right. So when the relationship is strong and it's positive and all of these dynamics are there, sex is great and it's just one other positive aspect of the relationship. But when the dynamics are not there and it is very negative, then it does take on this disproportionate effect. And it really becomes almost overbearing for a lot of people. And it becomes a weapon.
Right. And, where we left off last week, we promised to the conversation to come around to talking about cheating and infidelity and affairs and all this language and what these terms mean and how it relates to, the same thread follows throughout.
Absolutely.
And, poor communication. And as we said last week, how do people in relationships or not ideal relationships, how do they know what the rules are when they've broken them? Right? When it turns into a big conflict and things that were just not addressed.
Right. Well, I think that's the starting point for why so many relationships do tank. Right? I think we did mention this last time, and I think, again, it's always worth repeating that people go into their relationships, particularly marriages, where they're committing themselves for life, which is a scary proposition in and of itself.
Sure.
But they go in with assumptions, not agreements. Right?
That old blank contract again.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And then the assumption is what I'm thinking that I want from you. I know what you want from me. So the assumption is we know what the rules are. Right? And then we get surprised and blindsided when we find out we've broken rules. What rules are
What rules? When were they negotiated?
That's right. When did we agree on these
Sure.
things? Right?
Speaking of bearing repetition, let me give the number again.
Please
give us a call. 888-565-1470. Call in with your questions, your comments. We want to bring it around to talk about what is infidelity? Why do people cheat? Again, how do they know unless they've negotiated the terms, so to speak, of a relationship? And a very important concept that I think doesn't get talked about often enough, even among therapists, even in the training of couples therapists, and that is the difference between secrecy and privacy.
A very, very important distinction.
Right, because so often, and again, I hate to say it, but very often it's the therapist's own stuff where they're really indoctrinated to this idea that secrets in relationships are toxic and this kind of cancer that's going to grow and destroy a relationship, and that line is never drawn. And so by default, people think that if you're in a relationship, you give up your right to privacy.
Right. That honesty means you reveal everything about yourself.
Well, right. And whoever really does, completely the onion layers, right? Who is, the interviews on TV when somebody goes crazy and commits horrible acts. They always talk to the neighbors. Oh, he was such a quiet man. We lived in his building for 30 years. Who had no idea.
We never knew.
Even the wife, right? We shared a bed for 40 years. I had no idea. Well, we let people in as far as we choose to let them in. But I mean, just basic privacy. Of course, invariably, this issue leads people to think, although this is not what I'm intending by talking about it, but it leads people to think of issues like self-pleasuring and porn. And
sure.
That again, first of all, there's the myth that if someone is in a relationship, they don't need that anymore.
Exactly.
Right?
I don't satisfy you.
Right. Self-pleasuring is only for single people until, to hold them over until they can get into a relationship. And yeah, exactly. Why would you need to do that? You have me.
I mean, the reality of that, too, is that people that are in relationships that are even having a lot of sex in relationships will basically pleasure themselves more.
Right. Sure.
So it's not that it's a replacement. And I think that's the big misunderstanding for most people, that self-pleasuring is a replacement for partnered sex.
Right.
When in fact it's a standalone. And it has nothing to do with it. In fact, the more partnered sex, the more self-pleasuring people tend to do.
Indeed. Right. But so often this becomes one of these kind of possessive, again, especially if it's not talked about. Invariably, and therapists, again, our ongoing discussion about is there such a thing as porn addiction or sex addiction? Invariably, there's the bust. This is what brings someone or a couple into therapy, and depending on the bias or the lens of the therapist, again, sometimes the diagnosis walks in the door. Right. I came home early. I busted him looking at porn. So, oh my God, catastrophe. He must be a porn addict.
Right.
Because after all, he's in a relationship with me. Why else would he be resorting to this? It must be compulsive. It must be out of control.
Exactly.
Right.
And nobody's a porn addict on prom night.
Right, or on their honeymoon.
Yeah, or on their honeymoon.
Right.
Right. So you're right. The bust is very important, which is, I think, reflective of that idea of betrayal that's so inherent to the concept of infidelity. I mean, what does that even mean, infidelity? Disloyal. Right? To what?
To some agreement that really was not negotiated,
Right.
was not talked about explicitly.
Right.
It was just assumed. You should know, I should know. We don't have to write
right.
these things down, except we repeat after the priest, the minister, the rabbi, the justice of the peace in front of the friends and family. Nobody's negotiating then.
Okay. We have an email through Facebook there. So let's see what that says.
Understand that you do sex therapy. Can you do couples counseling not involving the sexual side? Well, of course, right?
Sure.
All sex therapists are psychotherapists first.
Right.
And sex therapy certainly is a form of couples counseling. And very often couples need couples counseling to kind of prepare them for sex therapy. If there's a lot of anger, if there's a lot of betrayal, if there's fires burning, then sex therapy is really not a good idea until the fires are put out.
Right. Right.
But sex therapy certainly is an effective intervention. And of course, with our bias, not just because of our training and our theoretical orientation, but because we know that it works from working with couples, the reason why sex therapy is effective, not instead of, but in addition to,
Right.
is that it keeps the couple's focus on, well, the fact that they're lovers. Most of the time, they started out that way. And how do they stay that way? And my biggest gripe with losing that focus is just like so much of the sex addiction diagnosis. It tends to take the current crisis and freeze it.
Yes,
into
exactly.
the new
It defines
permanent.
the relationship.
Right now, this is the new permanent instead of we're looking at it as a crisis in the relationship that can be worked through.
Exactly.
That can be in the rearview mirror.
Right. And, the relationship is a context. And the sexual part, the sexuality, the sex therapy, that's one domain out of several domains that make up the relationship.
Right.
And, I think part of what, you're saying and what we have, said previously, it's not that the sex part and the sex therapy is necessary for every relationship, and it's not that all the relationships are only, we just only focus on the sex part, but it happens to be the one that is the most overlooked and the most neglected, so it just happens to be the focus of that particular specialty.
Yeah.
But it's not to say that it should define the whole relationship,
Sure.
because that's kind of like repeating the same problem.
Whoever sent that question, and thank you. I'm glad for
yes.
that. It's a good, it's an important reminder. I think we were griping over the past weeks that in a perfect world this wouldn't be a specialty, that all therapists would be trained, all couples therapists would be trained in sexuality. But until it is a perfect world and sexually healthy, it's a wonderful thrill to be able to work with therapists and train them to work with sexual issues.
Absolutely.
But I think of all therapists, again, here my bias is showing, but sex therapists are really cross-trained. They need to be very well-versed in systemic approaches to seeing the couple as a patient and the bigger picture. And certainly there's the medical component in working with sexual medicine, with physicians, nurse practitioners, physical therapists, all these wonderful, the dream team members, as Marilyn Volker calls them, our dear mentor, Marilyn. And, as my late mentor, Susan Lee, used to describe sex therapy as a cognitive behavioral therapy with a psychodynamic underpinning that you can't ignore that history. You can't ignore the baggage, the luggage that people bring into a relationship from their past. You can't ignore intergenerational things. But when possible, to stay in the present here and now and look at a sexual problem, the history of the sexual problem, Has it started recently within the past 6 months or a year or 2 years, or has it always been this way? The history of the relationship. Very often it doesn't require what most people think of being in therapy, years of lying on the couch and psychoanalysis and talking about, year after year of talking for insight. It's very behavioral and focused on fixing the problem.
Sure. And again, in the context of the relationship.
Right.
And again, one of the things that I also liked about that previous question was, one of the things that often leads to why people do have a lot of sexual problems, particularly when we look at the most common problem in relationships, has to do with desire. And I know you wanted to hold some stuff. I wanted to give a plug to our very dear friend, Esther Perel, whose first book called Mating in Captivity, I think really put some very key ideas out there for people. There's a little plug for it there.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for people to keep in mind something that it's almost seeming like it's counterintuitive. Right? It's almost seeming paradoxical.
Right.
But the things that people tend to strive for in their relationship, the things that we tend to look at as being the basis of a good relationship, trust, safety,
The nesting,
comfort,
right?
all
The
of that
bonding.
stuff, which is nice, but it kills. I mean,
Right.
kills eroticism.
We were trying to recall on the way to the studio this evening when we met Esther, I think probably around 2004.
2004, yeah.
She was already, quite established as a marriage and family therapist, and her brilliance, her orbit spun around into the sex therapy world, and she came into ASECT and met all of us sex therapists. And her book, Mating in Captivity, certainly made a splash among sex therapists.
Sure.
And it's also one of the single handful of books that I'm not one of those therapists that's quick to recommend books to patients, but that's certainly one. And even the title, I talk about before I even send them off to get the book, even just the title speaks volumes.
Yeah.
Mating in Captivity. That
Right.
idea of the domesticated marriage. Right? But I think why she made such a huge splash was not necessarily that she said anything so new, but like you're saying, she said something that all of us therapists always knew but didn't want to admit. That kind of Hallmark card stuff about relationships is, what's the term you used to use? An anaphrodisiac, right? It kills the erotic.
Yeah, it really does.
It domesticates. Right? I'll never forget this couple that came in for sex therapy. This was like the dream case. Every sex therapist should get at least one of these at some point in their career. Young, hot couple, really hot for each other. They came in, we're pregnant, and we don't want to turn into our parents. And they just wanted, help keep it right through the pregnancy, through the birth of their child, to keep the marriage erotic, to not lose that.
Yes.
That's the dream.
It really is. And I think the key there is their openness rather than their sort of embedded expectations.
Right.
Because I think, again, it comes down to that really being the culprit behind so much of this conflict. That sense of, and it's even one of the, the Song of Songs and the Psalms, back into the Old Testament,
in the Bible.
That enmeshment, that I am my beloved is me.
Oh.
No, that's a very unhealthy dynamic. That enmeshment, that having to be so connected to each other is something that Esther, even in her new book, I believe, State of Affairs,
yeah, I want to plug
talks about
that
entrapment.
Too. This is coming out in October, The State of Affairs. I'm looking forward to reading that. She's just brilliant. You got to look for her TED Talks, or she's got a series now of her own, and important work. So another major theme from Mating in Captivity, and because Esther is not from the United States originally, She's Belgian and speaks 9 languages fluently and has studied all over and is able to make this kind of sociological observation about a very fundamental difference in what she refers to as a typical American response versus a typical European response to an affair. Right? To, again, the big bust.
Exactly.
Where very often the European response may be, well, what does this mean for us? Right? Are we done? You want to be with the other? You want to be with me? Where are we at? What does this mean for our relationship? And the American reaction too often is this, how could you do this to me?
Right. The whole default to victimization.
And the morality play.
Right.
Right. So, of course, which one stands the better chance of succeeding for the couple to get past the crisis in the relationship?
Right. And to be
the
willing
moral
to
outrage is going to impede any kind of success.
But the whole willingness to get past that and not get into the doghouse dynamic, not get into that. My ego has been so trampled on, this zero tolerance, and it doesn't do anybody any good. And it certainly defines, and we know that Esther has gotten a lot of grief over the years too, by even some people in the field, by just even suggesting that for a lot of relationships, the affair can be the best thing that ever happened to
like a nuclear blast to save the relationship, to knock them back, to remind them what they're doing there, and
to focus on their commitment. For some, it's the first and only time they start talking about the relationship and their dynamics. The ego that gets in the way, and we've talked about this before too, even looking at getting through, something that we get a lot of grief about when we say things like that. People don't understand the difference between fault and responsibility. That in that sort of victim-perpetrator dynamic, that even though maybe one person engaging in the behavior, but the reality is the other person has just as much responsibility in this dynamic as the person engaging in the behavior.
People so angry.
It does.
To suggest that it's a couple's dynamic, it's a couple's issue, that it takes two to tango. No, the perpetrator, the betrayer, has to be punished, and that's it. The relationship is done.
Exactly.
If one turns into the warden, the cop, the angry parent,
the mommy,
the relationship is done.
Right. And I like how you often sort of characterize it, that when you get that doghouse dynamic, and especially if we look at a common dynamic where, let's say, a female partner and the male is the perpetrator, and he said, okay, well, all right, we'll get through this. I'll take you back, or I won't leave you, but you have to prove yourself to me. You have to make me want to trust you again.
Right.
And that's never going to happen in that dynamic.
Yeah.
Right? Because as you often describe it, that creates this sort of parent-child dynamic, and we are wired biologically to not be sexually turned on by mommy or by our children.
Yeah.
So when that dynamic sets up, then it becomes even more traumatic for them later on, because there's no sex, and they stop, and there's a wall that they can't seem to break through.
Well, it's my turn to say it. You know what the music means.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all for listening. Write it down for next week. 888-565-1470, and email your questions. Thanks. Monday night, 9 p.m., Sex Talk with Dr. Richard Siegel. See you next week.
And check us out on Facebook and YouTube.
Thanks to my brother Larry Siegel.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to Sex Talk with Dr. Richard Siegel. Join us every Monday night at 9 on WNN, 1470 AM and 95.3 FM. Or watch live streaming video at AMP2 TV Productions on Facebook, or look for the shows on YouTube. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you'll join us again next week. The opinion